Hi there, welcome back. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe. Now let's begin. The scent of olive trees lingered in the warm Roman air as dusk painted the sky in golden hues. Marcus Aurelius, draped in a simple woolen cloak, stood on the balcony of his palace, his gaze lost in the endless horizon beyond the Tiber. He was not merely an emperor, not merely the ruler of Rome's vast dominion. He was a man burdened by duty, by war, by the fragility of human nature. His days were consumed by the ceaseless demands of state, his nights by restless contemplation. He had led Rome through plague, through rebellion, through the constant threat of the Germanic tribes pressing against the empire's northern borders. Yet despite the turmoil that surrounded him, his greatest struggle lay within. A single oil lamp flickered beside the wooden writing desk in his chamber. He sat, dipping the tip of his quill into ink, and began to write, not for the Senate, not for the historians, but for himself. Begin each day with this thought: today I shall encounter the meddler, the ingrate, the arrogant, the deceiver, the envious. They act so because they do not know good from evil. But I, who have seen the nature of the good, will not be troubled. His words were his refuge. They were his shield against the pettiness of court politics, against the betrayals of supposed allies, against the fleeting nature of glory. He thought back to his youth, to his teacher, the philosopher Rusticus, who had placed the works of Epictetus in his hands. Remember Caesar, Rusticus had said, true power lies not in dominion over others, but in dominion over oneself. The lesson had remained with him, shaping his every action. When the Senate flattered him, he remained unmoved. When the people cheered his name, he accepted their praise with the same detachment as he did their criticism. A knock at the door pulled him from his writing. His servant Cleander entered and bowed. "Caesar, the generals await your counsel on the coming campaign." Marcus exhaled slowly. War again. He placed his quill down and rose to his feet. If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it. As he stepped into the torch-lit corridors of the palace, his mind remained anchored in his reflections. He knew the path ahead would be steep, but he had chosen long ago to walk it with dignity, with reason, with an unshaken soul. And so the philosopher-emperor marched forward, into the night, into history. The war council chamber was dimly lit, the flames of torches casting restless shadows against the marble walls. Around a great wooden table stood the finest military minds of Rome, seasoned generals with hardened faces, their expressions carved by years of bloodshed and conquest. Maps lay sprawled before them, detailing the northern frontier, where the Germanic tribes threatened Rome's dominion. Marcus Aurelius entered with measured steps. He was no mere figurehead, no ruler who dictated war from the comforts of a golden throne. He had fought alongside his soldiers, endured the same harsh winters, witnessed the same horrors of battle. As he took his seat, the murmurs of the council ceased. "Caesar," General Pertinax spoke first, his voice steady, "the Marcomanni are rallying once more. Scouts report that their war bands gather along the Danube, emboldened by our delay. We cannot afford to hesitate." Marcus ran his fingers along the worn edges of the map. He knew the truth of the general's words. The northern wars had dragged on for years, consuming resources, draining Rome's strength. Yet, the more they fought, the more the tribes resisted. What was victory if the cost was an endless cycle of bloodshed? "There is no doubt that we must act," Marcus said at last, his voice calm but firm, "but not with haste. A rushed campaign leads to reckless decisions. We must strike with reason, not rage." A younger commander, Claudius Julianus, leaned forward, frustration evident in his tone. "With respect, Caesar, reason will not halt their advance. The longer we wait, the stronger they become." Marcus studied the faces around him. These men were warriors, not philosophers. They understood the language of the sword, not the discipline of the mind. "Tell me, Julianus," Marcus said, "if you were to wake tomorrow and find yourself in the place of our enemy, what would you do?" The young general hesitated. Marcus continued, "Would you not seek to defend your people as they do? Would you not resist a foreign power that encroaches upon your lands? Strength alone does not break the will of men. Even the fiercest barbarian believes he fights for his own justice." The room fell silent. Marcus leaned back. "We must be as relentless in our wisdom as we are in our warfare. We will move against them, but not without ensuring that Rome stands. To gain more than just another temporary victory, we must subdue them not only with our might, but with our reason." The council dispersed, some leaving in quiet contemplation, others in silent dissent. Later that night, as Marcus returned to his tent, the wind howled across the vast frozen plains. He pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders, his mind heavy with the weight of war. Sitting before a lone candle, he opened his journal once more. "Think of what you have. Not the empire, not the legions, but your own mind. That is the only true possession of any man. If it remains unshaken, uncorrupted, then no war, no enemy, no death can take anything from you." He closed his eyes, allowing the words to settle. Tomorrow the campaign would begin, but tonight his mind would remain his own. The winter sun barely pierced through the thick gray clouds as Marcus Aurelius rode at the head of his legion. The ground was frozen solid beneath the hooves of thousands of horses, the breath of men and beasts alike rising in misty plumes. Before them lay the Danube, its icy waters marking the threshold between Rome and the wild lands of the Marcomanni. For weeks, the scouts had reported enemy movements, war bands gathering in the dense forests beyond the river, their numbers growing with each passing day. Now the moment had come. There would be no more waiting. Marcus halted his horse atop a small rise, surveying the land before him. The enemy was near, hidden within the shadow of towering pines. He could feel it in the stillness of the air, in the way the birds had gone. Silent, a horn blared from the Roman ranks, and his officers rode to his side. Pertinax, ever the strategist, was the first to speak. "They will strike before nightfall," he said, eyes locked on the darkened tree line. "They know we are coming." Marcus nodded. He had seen this before, how the northern tribes fought with the desperation of men who had nothing to lose. They did not fight for empire, for gold, or for legacy. They fought for their homes, for their survival. The first arrow came suddenly, slicing through the air and striking a legionary's shield with a sharp thud. Then another and another. From the forest, the enemy charged, hundreds of them, their war cries echoing across this frozen plain. "Shields up!" a centurion bellowed. The Roman lines closed, the discipline of years of training turning chaos into order. The first wave of Marcomanni warriors crashed into their shields, and the battle began. Marcus remained on horseback, watching as steel met flesh, as the clash of swords and the screams of the dying filled the air. His hands clenched the reins tightly. He despised war, yet he knew its necessity. Rome could not survive without defending its borders. A group of barbarian riders broke through the Roman flank, charging toward the command post. Marcus drew his sword. He had spent years in the field. He was no stranger to battle. With a swift motion, he parried the first attacker's blade, then drove his weapon into the man's side. The warrior fell from his horse with a cry. More came. Marcus fought with measured precision, his movements those of a man who understood that victory was not about fury, but about control. Hours passed before the enemy's ranks began to break. The discipline of Rome had prevailed once more. The Marcomanni retreated into the trees, leaving their dead behind. Marcus dismounted, his legs aching from the cold. He walked among the fallen Romans and barbarians alike. Each face told a story, each body a life now lost. As his soldiers gathered around him, waiting for his command, he spoke, not as an emperor, but as a man who understood the cost of war. Remember, this day, he said, not for the victory, but for the lives it has taken. We are not here for glory. We are here to bring order to chaos, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Let us not become like the very men we fight. That night, as the fires of the Roman camp flickered under the vast, indifferent sky, Marcus returned to his tent and picked up his journal. The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. If we think only of war, we will become war itself. But if we hold on to virtue, even in the midst of battle, we remain who we are. With that he closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring more blood, more loss, but within him the fire of reason would not waver. The battlefield lay silent beneath a sky tinged with the red of dawn. Smoke still rose from the smoldering remains of the enemy's camp, and the scent of blood and ash clung to the frozen air. Marcus Aurelius stood at the edge of the field, his cloak wrapped tightly around him, his expression unreadable. Victory had been won, but at what cost? Behind him, the Roman legions moved through the remnants of war. Some gathered weapons from the fallen, others tended to the wounded. Among them, Marcus saw a young soldier kneeling beside the body of an older man, perhaps his father or a friend. The boy's face was streaked with dirt and grief, his hands shaking as he closed the dead man's eyes. Marcus turned away. He had seen too much of this, too many lives lost in the name of Rome. And yet he knew there was no alternative. The empire could not survive without defense, without war. It was a contradiction he had wrestled with for years. As he made his way back to the Roman encampment, his advisors awaited him. General Pertinax was the first to speak. The enemy has scattered, Caesar. If we push forward, we can take their remaining strongholds before the snows deepen. Marcus exhaled slowly. And how many more must die for that to happen? Pertinax hesitated. He knew his emperor's heart, knew the burden he carried. If we do not act now, they will regroup. They will strike again. Marcus walked past him, entering the command tent. A map of the northern territories lay spread across the wooden table. His generals followed, watching as he traced a line along the Danube with his fingers. "We will advance," he said at last, "but not as conquerors. We will offer terms." A murmur passed through the room. One of the younger officers, Julianus, frowned. "Terms? After what they have done?" Marcus met his gaze. "And what have we done, Julianus? Have we not slaughtered them as they have slaughtered us? If we offer peace and they refuse, then we will fight. But let us first show that we are not only men of the sword." The decision was made. Within hours, envoys were sent to the enemy tribes, carrying an offer of surrender, an opportunity to live under Rome's protection rather than perish against its might. Some would reject it, some would fight to the bitter end, but some would accept, and that Marcus knew was enough. That night, as he sat by the fire, he opened his journal once more. A man's worth is measured not by his victories in war, but by his victories over himself. To rule is not to command, but to serve. And to serve is to bear the weight of every life entrusted to you. The weight of empire had never felt heavier. Days passed in tense silence as the envoys rode into the frozen wilderness, carrying Rome's message of peace. Marcus Aurelius remained in the encampment, awaiting their return. He knew the risk. Mercy was often mistaken for weakness. The northern tribes had fought Rome for decades, their hatred deep-seated, their pride unyielding. Would they accept his offer, or would they see it as an opportunity to strike once more? The waiting weighed on him. Each morning he walked the perimeter of the camp, speaking with the soldiers, listening to their grievances. They did not all share his patience. Many longed for battle, for the final conquest that would crush the enemy once and for all. One evening, as the snow began to fall, the envoys returned. The entire camp gathered to hear the outcome. Pertinax approached Marcus, his face unreadable. "Some tribes have agreed, Caesar. They will lay down their arms in exchange for land under Roman rule." Marcus inclined his head. It was as he had hoped. War could be won not only with steel, but with wisdom. Then Pertinax's expression darkened. But others refused. One envoy did not return. His head was sent back to us, nailed to his own shield. A murmur of outrage rippled through the gathered soldiers. The message was clear. Mercy had been met with scorn. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment. He had known this outcome was possible, yet it did not lessen the weight of it. War once again was unavoidable. Julianus stepped forward, fire in his voice. "This is proof, Caesar, that they cannot be reasoned with. We must strike before they have the chance to strike us." A silence followed, all eyes turning to their emperor. Marcus remained still, the cold wind tugging at his cloak. His mind drifted to the lessons of the philosophers, Seneca, Epictetus, who had taught that suffering was inevitable, but how one responded to it defined a man's soul. At last, he spoke. "We will move against those who defy Rome, but we will not become them." Julianus's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, Caesar?" Marcus turned to face his men. "We do not fight for vengeance. We do not fight for the pleasure of bloodshed. We fight to restore order, to bring an end to this war, not to prolong it." He let his words settle before continuing. "Tomorrow we march, but let it be known, we are not butchers, we are Romans." That night, as the fires of the camp flickered under the vast expanse of the winter sky, Marcus returned to his journal. "Hold fast to reason, even when the world tempts you to anger. The mind is the only fortress that cannot be breached. unless we surrender it ourselves. As he closed his eyes, he knew the road ahead would not be easy. The coming battle would be brutal. The burden of mercy was heavy, but it was a burden he would not abandon. The dawn was gray and somber, a blanket of snow covering the earth in a cold silence. The Roman legions, ever disciplined, moved in perfect order as they prepared to march once more into the heart of enemy territory. The banners of Rome fluttered in the wind, but Marcus Aurelius felt no pride in their display. He was not a conqueror, not in the way history would remember him, but a man weighed down by the necessity of war. Ahead, the enemy had fortified their position along a steep ridge, their warriors standing in tight formation. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene. The Marcomanni had clearly taken the emperor's offer of peace as an insult, and now they were prepared to fight too. The death beside him, General Pertinax spoke in hushed tones. "We are outnumbered, Caesar. If we strike head-on, the cost will be high." Marcus nodded. The decision was clear. "Then we will strike from the flanks, divide their forces, force them to fight on multiple fronts. The more confused they are, the fewer will survive." The order was given, and the legions began their advance. With each step, the soldiers of Rome moved as one, a well-oiled machine, honed by years of warfare. Their shields were raised, their weapons ready, but it was the discipline of their minds that set them apart. They did not fight for glory or hatred. They fought for the empire, for the order they had sworn to uphold. The first clash came with the sharp, ringing sound of metal on metal. The Roman infantry met the Marcomanni at the base of the ridge. The battle was fierce, the noise of it deafening as swords sliced through the air and shields splintered under the weight of the blows. Marcus rode at the front of his forces, his eyes scanning the battlefield, searching for any sign of weakness, any opening that could bring an end to the chaos. A warrior from the enemy's front lines broke through, charging directly at the emperor. Without hesitation, Marcus raised his sword, meeting the attack with swift precision. The barbarian fell, but more were coming, more than he had ever faced in his life. He could hear their war cries, could feel the ground shake beneath the feet of hundreds of men locked in combat. The Roman lines held, but the pressure was mounting. It wasn't just a battle of steel, it was a battle of wills. Marcus was no stranger to the pain and sorrow that came with war, but it was the faces of the men around him, their expressions hardened by fear and bloodlust, that weighed most. Heavily on his heart, hours passed and the tide of battle shifted back and forth. It seemed as though victory was within grasp, only to slip away in an instant. Marcus had seen this pattern too many times in his campaigns. Victory was never certain, and the price of it was never fully paid until the last man had fallen. By midday, the Marcomanni began to retreat, their warriors fleeing into the dense forest, leaving behind the wounded and the dying. The Roman legions stood victorious, but it was a hollow victory. Marcus looked around at the faces of his soldiers, some of them covered in the blood of the fallen, others shaking with exhaustion. The battlefield was quiet once more, save for the sounds of the wounded. "Bring the prisoners forward," Marcus commanded. He was not interested in celebration or triumph. He needed answers. He needed to understand why this war had continued for so long, why his enemies had fought with such blind fury. The prisoners were brought before him, men, women, and children, many barely more than peasants, driven to fight by the few who controlled them. Their eyes were full of fear, but there was no malice in them. They had been pawns, swept up in a tide of violence they could not control. Marcus's gaze softened. For a moment he saw not enemies, but human beings, people like him, struggling to find their place in a world ruled by power. He looked to his generals who stood waiting for orders. "No more executions," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Send them back to their homes. Give them the opportunity to choose peace, as we offered." Pertinax frowned. "But Caesar, some will surely return to their tribes and continue to fight." Marcus exhaled slowly, weighing the cost of his words. "Perhaps, but we must give them the chance to make the right choice. The true victory is not in defeating them, but in showing them a different way." That evening, as the camp settled for the night, Marcus returned to his tent. The weight of the battle still lingered, but his mind had found some solace in the decision he had made. He opened his journal and wrote, "War will never end. It is a cycle that exists as long as there are men who seek to control. But we must remember, our strength lies not in our ability to destroy, but in our ability to create peace." With that thought, he closed the journal and for the first time in weeks, allowed himself to rest. The following days passed in a haze of recovery. The Roman legions, though victorious, were weary. The wounds of battle, both physical and emotional, were slow to heal. The field was littered with the remnants of war, and the camp itself echoed with the sounds of men tending to their injuries, rebuilding their strength. The winter air was sharp and unforgiving, yet within the walls of Marcus Aurelius's command tent, there was a stillness that offered some comfort. Despite the quiet, Marcus found no peace. He sat alone in the dim light of his lamp, his thoughts, a constant swirl of doubt and reflection. The victory, once so desired, now felt like a hollow achievement. What had been gained? A temporary respite from violence, perhaps, but peace seemed ever elusive. In his mind, he kept returning to the prisoners, those innocent lives caught in the wake of a war they never sought. His hand hovered over the pages of his journal, and then, with a sigh, he began to write. "We fight not because we desire war, but because we are forced into it. Every battle is a choice, but the choice is not always ours. It is the choice of those who live in ignorance, who do not see the consequence of their actions. Yet we cannot escape the burden of it." He paused, reflecting on the lessons of his youth, the teachings of Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who had shaped so much of his thinking. It was not the world that caused suffering, but the judgments we place upon it. Could he, Marcus Aurelius, truly live according to his philosophy in the midst of war? Was there a path forward, a way to find peace within himself, even when the world around him was consumed by conflict? The question haunted him. In his private moments, when the sounds of the camp grew quiet and the soldiers lay down to rest, Marcus found himself seeking solace in the teachings that had guided him throughout his life. He closed his eyes and thought of the Stoics. The obstacle is the way. His thoughts turned to the future. The Marcomanni had been defeated, but there would always be another tribe, another enemy waiting at Rome's borders. The empire stretched far and wide, and as its ruler, Marcus knew that the responsibility of leadership would never end. He could not, He would not abandon his soldiers or his people. But what kind of ruler did that make him? He remembered a passage from Meditations, one that had often given him pause. Look to yourself and ask, what do I need? How can I become better? It was a lesson he had learned well. Leadership, for all its demands, began within. It was not the glory of victory or the fear of defeat that defined him, but the strength of his mind, the capacity for self-control, for rational thought, for justice. To lead was not to command others with fear, but to serve them with wisdom. That night, as Marcus lay beneath a blanket of furs, he found some measure of peace in his thoughts. The war had taken much, but it had also given him clarity. The Stoic ideal of virtue, though difficult to uphold, was his guide. In the face of war, in the face of grief, he would remain true to the path of reason. What is not good for the hive cannot be good for the bee, he wrote in his journal, quoting the philosopher Marcus Aurelius had long admired. It was a reminder that the well-being of the empire depended not just on military might, but on moral strength. It was a constant balancing act between duty and mercy, between the demands of the empire and the needs of the individual. And so, Marcus Aurelius resolved to keep moving forward, even as the weight of his decisions threatened to crush him. He would not yield to despair or bitterness. The path ahead was uncertain, but in the quiet of his tent, he found the strength to keep walking it. The snow continued to fall as Marcus Aurelius led his legions back toward the Roman heartland. But the feeling of victory no longer settled easily in his chest. The campaign had ended, the immediate threats quelled, yet a new challenge now loomed. On the horizon, the challenge of governance, the challenge of leadership without a battlefield. As the emperor journeyed back to Rome, his thoughts turned inward, examining the constant struggle for balance between duty and the well-being of his soul. The Stoic teachings he so reverently followed seemed ever more difficult to apply as the complexities of ruling the vast Roman Empire pressed upon him. The needs of the people, the demands of his generals, the politics of the Senate, it was an endless cycle of obligations that seemed to drain his very essence. Arriving at the gates of Rome, Marcus was greeted with the usual fanfare, the proud, unwavering legions, their faces marked by fatigue but lit with the glimmer of victory. The senators eager to pay their respects and secure their places in the empire's future. It was a celebration, a ritual that he had grown accustomed to, but Marcus felt no joy in it. To him, it was a reminder of the hollow nature of public life, where appearances often eclipse the deeper struggles of the soul. As he entered the grand hall of the Senate, the murmurs of the aristocracy faded into silence. The senators rose to their feet, their eyes fixed on the emperor, their faces a mixture of admiration and calculation. Marcus knew that behind the smiles and the speeches, many sought their own gain. The game of politics was one he had never truly embraced, but it was the arena in which he had to fight. Senator Verus, an old ally of his, approached him with a bow of the head. "Caesar, we rejoice in your victory. Rome is safe once again, thanks to your strength and wisdom." Marcus nodded, offering a polite smile. "Rome's safety is not the result of one man, Verus, but of all who stand in defense of it. My actions are but a small part of a greater whole." The senator's eyes gleamed with interest. "And yet, you are the heart of that whole, Caesar. Without you, the empire would surely crumble. We must ensure that you remain strong for the good of all." Marcus could feel the weight of his position pressing against him, and a deep weariness settled in his bones. It was the same adoration, the same flattery, but it did nothing to assuage the doubts he had about the path he was on. Was he truly serving Rome, or was he merely feeding the desires of those around him who sought power and influence? The Senate session began, and the conversations turned toward the pressing matters of the empire: taxation, military expansion, foreign relations. The discussions were long and arduous, and though Marcus took part in them, his mind wandered to the lives of the people, the ordinary citizens whose struggles were rarely seen in the grand halls of power. Later, as the Senate emptied and the evening descended upon the city, Marcus found himself walking alone through the streets of Rome. The grand buildings rose high above him, but beneath them the city hummed with the lives of its people. He passed by the markets, where merchants hawked their goods, the workers, their faces tired from a day's labor, the children playing in the streets without care for the empire's weight. It was these people, he realized, that he served, these faces, these lives. He had been born into a position of privilege, of power, but the true rulers of Rome were not the senators or generals. They were the common people who made the empire function. They were the ones who suffered when the empire faltered, the ones whose voices were often silenced in the name of glory and conquest. Marcus paused at the edge of the forum, his thoughts heavier than ever. He thought of the Stoic teachings that had guided him through so much of his life, the reminders that the mind could not be ruled by external forces, that one's actions were the only true measure of virtue. But how could he reconcile the ideals of justice with the reality of ruling an empire built on conquest and control? It was a question without an easy answer. But as the wind blew through the stone streets of Rome, Marcus Aurelius made a silent vow to seek the truth in all things. He would not be swayed by the pomp and circumstance of his position. He would look beyond the walls of power and remember the people for whom he had been entrusted to rule. That night, as he sat alone in his chambers, Marcus returned to his journal. To rule is not to be exalted, but to be burdened. The true weight of leadership lies not in the applause of the Senate or the adoration of the people, but in the quiet moments of reflection when one faces the truth of their own soul. The days that followed were marked by a deep silence within Marcus Aurelius. As the empire continued to function around him, he retreated more into his private moments, seeking solace in the solitude that had so often brought him clarity. Rome was alive with activity, its grand architecture and bustling markets a constant reminder of the empire's vast reach. But in Marcus's heart, there was a growing distance between himself and the world he governed. It was not the people he had grown distant from, but the very nature of power itself. The more he ruled, the more he saw the faults and contradictions that lay beneath the surface of imperial glory. The Senate, despite their fine speeches, continued to play their games of politics. The generals, though loyal, were always seeking favor and influence, and the people, though they loved Rome, were weighed down by the burdens of war and taxation. Marcus could not ignore the shadows of doubt that clung to him. Was his rule truly just? Were his decisions in line with the ideals he so deeply cherished? As a Stoic, he believed that wisdom was the highest virtue, but wisdom did not always provide easy answers. It only presented the weight of truth, the truth that leadership in all its forms was fraught with uncertainty. One afternoon, while walking through the gardens of his palace, Marcus was approached by a young philosopher, one of the many who sought his counsel. The man was eager, his eyes bright with the fervor of youth, but Marcus saw the uncertainty behind his enthusiasm. He had been in those same shoes once, filled with the idealism of philosophy, eager to find answers to the world's suffering. "Emperor," the philosopher said with reverence, "you are the embodiment of wisdom. The people turn to you for guidance. You, who have faced wars and battles, who have held the fate of an empire in your hands, how can you endure such weight without being consumed by it?" Marcus studied the young man for a moment, feeling the gravity of his question. "It is not the weight of the empire that bears down on me," he replied softly, "but the weight of my own thoughts. The decisions I make, the actions I take, they all come from the same place within me. I do not govern by the desires of others, but by what I believe to be right." The philosopher nodded, though his expression remained puzzled. "But how? Can one know what is truly right? The world is full of conflict and suffering, and yet you, Caesar, remain unmoved. How is that possible?" Marcus smiled faintly. "It is not that I am unmoved. I too feel the weight of the world, but I have learned that suffering is part of the human experience. We cannot avoid it. We can only choose how we respond to it. The key is not to let external forces, wars, politics, fame, control our hearts. We must remain true to our inner virtue." The young philosopher seemed to contemplate this, but Marcus could sense his lingering doubts. "There are times," Marcus continued, "when the path of virtue seems unclear. In those moments, we must rely on reason and wisdom to guide us. But even then, the choices we make may cause pain. No one can avoid the consequences of their actions. Then how do you live, Emperor? How do you carry the burden of leadership?" Marcus looked out over the garden, his mind drifting back to the many years of conflict, both external and internal. He had led armies, made decisions that affected the lives of thousands, and yet, at the end of the day, he was still a man. Man with doubts, fears, and regrets. "I carry it by remembering that I am not above anyone else," Marcus replied. "I am but a part of the whole. The empire does not rest solely on my shoulders, nor does the world depend on me alone. I am only a link in a much larger chain, and in that I find peace. My purpose is to do what I believe is right, no matter the outcome. To govern not for myself, but for the good of all." The philosopher bowed, humbled by Marcus's words. "Thank you, Caesar. Your wisdom brings clarity to my heart." Marcus nodded in return, but his heart remained heavy. The young man's question had been simple, but the answer was anything but. To lead was to carry a burden, yes, but also to question every action, every decision, every choice. The true test of wisdom, Marcus realized, was not in having all the answers, but in embracing the uncertainty of the human condition and continuing to walk the path of virtue despite it. That evening, as Marcus returned to his chambers, he once again took up his journal. He wrote quietly, his hand steady as he penned his thoughts. Wisdom does not come from avoiding the burdens of life, but from accepting them with humility. It is the recognition that we, as individuals, are but small parts of the greater whole of existence. We are not masters of fate, but participants. In the journey, our role is not to seek control, but to act with integrity, even when the road ahead is unclear. As the lamp flickered and the night deepened, Marcus closed the journal and set it aside. There would be no easy answers, no simple path, but in the quiet of his soul, he had found a peace that did not depend on the world's approval, nor on the triumph of the empire. It was a peace rooted in the unwavering commitment to virtue and wisdom, no matter the cost. The years had passed, as years tend to do, leaving behind a world that seemed both familiar and distant at the same time. Rome, the empire Marcus Aurelius had spent his life serving, had grown older, as had he. The constant campaign of thought, of leading, of reflecting, it had taken its toll on his body and mind. He had faced wars, endured countless struggles, but the quiet battles within himself had always remained the most formidable. As Marcus sat alone in his study, the once grand room now shrouded in the dim light of dusk, the emperor knew that his time was drawing to a close. He had written his meditations, a testament to his inner journey, a guide for anyone who would seek wisdom through the trials of life. But now, as he looked back on his reign, he found that the greatest lessons he had learned were not from the heights of power or the fields of battle. They had been learned in solitude, in moments of stillness, in the quiet acceptance of life's impermanence. In the final years of his life, Marcus had come to understand that no emperor could escape the fundamental truths of existence, that all things were temporary, that death was inevitable, and that the true measure of one's life lay not in their achievements, but in the way they lived each day. The empire he had worked so tirelessly to build would eventually crumble, just as his own body would return to dust. All that would remain were the actions he had taken, the people he had influenced, and the wisdom he had sought to live by. On a quiet evening, Marcus made his way to the great library where the scrolls of his thoughts were kept. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the final volume of his meditations. In the last pages, he had written of his own mortality, of the acceptance that all things must come to an end. Do not waste time on what you cannot control, he had written. Live according to reason, according to virtue, and accept the end of all things with grace. In his heart, Marcus knew this was the final lesson, to embrace the inevitable and let go of the need to control it. For years, he had sought to master his thoughts, his desires, and his empire, but now he understood that the greatest wisdom was found in surrender, not in giving up, but in giving in to the flow of life. The time had come. The emperor called for his children, his loved ones, to be by his side. He could feel the weight of his years, the weariness of his spirit. His body, once strong, now ached with the toll of a life lived in service of something greater than himself. But as he looked at the faces of those who had shared in his journey, Marcus felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had done what he could, had striven to live in accordance with the Stoic ideals he so revered. There would be no final
you.